Ever since PT released back in 2014, and honestly even arguably since the release of the original Slender game, there have been an abundance of horror games, let alone indie horror games. The simplicity of those older games, Slender as a prime example, gave way to the rise of a bunch of people trying their hand at making the next big scare fest that would skyrocket the streaming waves of YouTube and horror content creators. This came right after a seemingly endless period of AAA games abandoning the horror genre almost entirely, with many series such as Dead Space in particular going from the return of survival horror into becoming one of the most atrocious co-op experiences that I could ever imagine, filled with action and abandoning more than enough of the horror to me to even want to classify it as a horror game. I say all of this to indicate my acceptance at the time of the horror genre being filled with a bunch of indie folks trying their hand at a genre that I was sure was pretty much dead regardless of those games' simplicity, because a lot of the games that these random folks made were scary. I distinctly remember never being able to beat the original Slender game, partly due to the overwhelming anxiety that I got at the time while trying to finish it. And say what you will about Five Nights at Freddy's, but that original game's tension was and still is palpable if you've not mastered its systems. Games like SCP Containment Breach and Visage are both examples of pure, unrelenting terror brought to a mouse and keyboard. But the thing is that most of these games, at the end of the day, were just walking simulators with a huge emphasis on making the player anxious and going full force into terror. This era of horror games in particular was so focused on just being gut-wrenchingly scary that all other mechanics seemed to fall by the wayside. Visage, however, did manage to retain some elements of what I would call classic survival horror with item management and puzzle elements, but it wasn't until the remake of Resident Evil 2 that I personally think that not only AAA horror games were back in a sense, but that even indie games started to branch out into more distinct horror territories outside of the walking simulator variety. Despite this indie era's simplicity, however, and despite my longing for classic mechanics-first survival horror to make a comeback, I was okay and happy with this era for one big reason. They were fucking scary. And on that note, I'm going to give away a huge secret. You ready? Come here. No, it's fine. I promise it's not going to be anything. I'm not going to jump scare. I promise I'm not going to jump scare you. The classic era of horror games, they were never scary. Now, of course, this is all my own opinion. But as someone who loves and cherishes that old era of horror games with all of my heart, despite potentially my blasphemous opinion, those games, they just weren't scary. They had elements that made you go, ooh, or maybe a moment or two that made your heart sink per game, but you could never get me to say that these old games were terrifying. What made the older games scary was less the actual feeling of horror, and more so the sense of tension that would occur due to trying to survive to the next save point with either limited inventory, intentionally awkward controls, creepy enemies, a weird monstrous boss, or something else of the like that would threaten to wipe you back to your last save file, potentially draining all of your progress. The horror didn't come from the horror. The horror came from the punishment of death. Hi, real quick, it's Mr. Sputnik from the future. I just wanted to pop in real quick and just clarify, because I know if I didn't, I would hear it until the end of time. The one exception to this is Enemy Zero on the Saturn, which, in my opinion, might still be the scariest game ever made. It's pure unrelenting anxiety for like 5 straight hours. I just wanted to clarify that. That's like the one big exception. Okay, love your face, love your show. Bye. To have this new trend of games that just went for the throat in terms of horror was something that I really appreciated, and especially after the honestly pretty terrible attempts that a lot of AAA horror games were attempting at the time.
Give me my stone!
I don't have your stone, and fuck you anyway.
I was just happy to have some variants of horror games that I could play whenever I wanted that were being released. But where we're at now, we've entered an era where horror games are releasing at such a pace and at such a wide net of styles that I get to not only have this new wave of games whose entire reason for existing is just to scare the ever-loving fuck out of you, but I also get to have my beloved classic mechanics-first horror game. Ever since this rebirth of classic survival horror, we've gotten quite a few games that, in my opinion, can stand the test of time. You've got My Friendly Neighborhood, which is basically an indie version of a modern Resident Evil game. You've got Signalis, which I have gone on record as saying is the best survival horror game since the original Resident Evil remake on the fucking GameCube. And you have games like Crow Country, Sorry We're Closed, and Elisa, which called back to the glory days of the genre and utilized nostalgia within not only its mechanics, but its visual style. And I understand that there have been plenty more than these couple games that I've mentioned here, but I think that these are the most important of the recent surge of classic survival horror, and I lead with all of this preamble because I think that the recently released Heartworm deserves its place among these recently released greats. Hey everyone, real quick aside before we get to the meat of the video. If you like what I do and you want to help support the channel, I finally have a Patreon. You can throw me a couple bucks, it'll help me get more videos out to you. Hopefully be able to do this at least part-time. Would really appreciate it. Just wanted to throw that out there for you. I always feel weird advertising myself, but I just have to let you know. I got a Patreon now. If you pay the highest tier, you get a shout out in the video, and today's shout out is to Shkotsky. I really hope I pronounced that right. I know I literally just messaged you how to do it, but I have to get the video out. I'm sorry. In Heartworm, you play as Sam, a character that is mourning the loss of a family member as they put their life on the line and venture into a long abandoned house that is said to be able to reconnect the living with their lost loved ones. But the caveat here is that no one that has ever gone into the house has ever come back. Sam, despite knowing what is at risk, heads for the abandoned house anyway, needing only to see their lost loved one again, reconnect with their past, and potentially give up any future that they might have had. Now, first things first, I'm going to get this right out of the way and say, can you tell that this game is taking inspiration from Resident Evil and Silent Hill? Yeah, these two games being a source of inspiration for a lot of modern indie horror developers is practically a trope, basically a meme at this point. People say that Souls-likes are a dime a dozen. Resident Evil and Silent Hill inspired horror games, let alone indie ones, gotta be a nickel a dozen at this point by now. If you're going to wear your influences on your sleeve, and specifically these two influences, then you better goddamn do something interesting or unique with it. Luckily, albeit barely, I'd say that Heartworm does manage to do enough with this formula that it does at least carve an identity for itself. It is mostly in its aesthetic flares and much less so its mechanical ones, but for the most part this is another instance of an indie dev showcasing their influences right there on their sleeves for you to look at. Heartworm taps into that classic survival horror style in many ways, but one of those in particular, in my opinion at least, is its emphasis on mechanics first in terms of your face value interaction with the game. Just like classic Resident Evil, you have limited inventory, save rooms, item boxes, puzzles, combat, and tank controls to learn, defeat, and master. But just like so many of those older games, they weren't really trying to terrify you, or at least I personally don't think so. I think Heartworm, just like so many of the classic games are, is a way to sit with the vibes and feel creeped out now and again. Very akin to a classic black and white horror movie that you put on during Halloween night and just sit down and feel cozy with. But just like those old classic survival horror games, Heartworm still puts you in the midst of a mystery, all while you still try to keep your little avatar character alive to make it through to the next puzzle. Many of those puzzles, leaning into the Silent Hill inspirations, are thematically tied to the game's narrative and Sam's arc throughout the game. And through a lot of these puzzles you do, you learn a lot about Sam as a character, as she will often narrate before or after certain puzzles, or after entering certain areas. And luckily, Heartworm feels fantastic. As clunky and as janky as many may still find tank controls to be now, if you click with them, Heartworm succeeds better than most when it comes to making them feel responsive and, in my opinion at least, feel closest to how I remember the Resident Evil Remake feeling. If you vibe with Resident Evil Remake's controls, you're going to feel right at home with Heartworm. And I think that Heartworm coalesces mechanically most successfully in its third and final main area. I just want you to think about this for a second. When was the last time that you played an indie game, let alone any game, where the last stage of the game was far and away the best level of the entire experience? Level design in a survival horror game, especially one that is aiming to capture the style of classic games to the level that Heartworm is going for, is incredibly important. What I always anticipate and hope for in games like this is a puzzle box. Not to keep beating a dead horse, but I think the gold standard for this style of game design is the Resident Evil Remake on the GameCube. In my opinion, it was and still is a masterclass of puzzle box game design where almost the entire game takes place in the one single location, the Spencer Mansion, and only briefly branching out to a couple smaller condensed separate puzzle boxes that still do weave back into the main mansion. Now, am I expecting every survival horror game to be as high quality or as finely tuned as Resident Evil on the GameCube? No, but I do at least compare every game in the genre to that and see where on the spectrum that it lands. And this is partially why I think the modern Resident Evil games, Village in particular, but in some regards, 7 as well, disappointed me so much because a lot of the puzzle box elements, while still technically there, are reduced to their absolute bare minimum. Found a locked door? There is a very high likelihood that the key is at the end of the only way forward, with a convenient and easy walk back to reduce the amount of steps needed to keep the player at the highest level of engagement. There is little to no chance that you will ever get lost, sidetracked, or anything else of the like. The other alternative to the streamlined design is what I think arguably is a good middle ground between the full-on streamlined option and the classic remake style, and that is segmenting your puzzle box into smaller compartments. And I think the easiest and one of the most recent examples to point to is the Silent Hill 2 remake. Not only was the original game segmented into smaller puzzle boxes with its dungeon design, but the remake also takes those dungeons and segments them into areas that are of themselves small little puzzle boxes. In my opinion, the hospital is the best part of the game, as in both the real world and the other world, you're often tasked with having to make distant treks between rooms in order to accomplish those tasks. But the Otherworld Hospital is split between 3 distinct sections that harbor all of the puzzle elements per section inside of their respective district of the hospital. I'm going to call this style of puzzle box design the segmented puzzle box. Now, finally getting back to the topic at hand, Heartworm does something interesting with its concept, and that's sort of blending the larger remake style puzzle box and the more segmented puzzle box design of the Silent Hill 2 remake. There are 3 distinct main locations in Heartworm outside of the central hub that you return to after completing each section. Now, these 3 main locations are not at all connected, as each one represents a segment of either Sam's past or a thematic relevance to the narrative. You'll explore a neighborhood, a forest path, and a gigantic clock tower. Each of these are distinct locations that you'll reach via the aforementioned hub. Each area, like I said, is its own puzzle box requiring their own forms of backtracking and a lot of door animations. But that in and of itself does not make a quality survival horror area. What I think makes an effective level in this regard is pretty nebulous, but it's sort of something that you just feel. I've said this before, but survival horror games, in the end, are really just spooky Metroidvanias that don't give you enough ammo. My favorite survival horror games are a first playthrough laced with looking at my inventory, looking at the map, trying to deduce where I have and haven't been, and trying to piece together where I have to go next or what item I can use in order to progress. If you manage to do this while also having an intricate map that doesn't feel like I don't have to think about where to go next, then I think you've more or less accomplished what I think makes a quality level in a survival horror game. And don't get me wrong, the first 2 levels in Heartworm do manage to accomplish this, with both of them being set in wide open areas, requiring plenty of backtracking and item usage that are subtle enough that would force me to constantly be going between screens trying to figure out what I needed to do. Exactly what I'm looking for. Each of these 2 first areas are designed well enough, but there's something about open areas that makes the levels feel tedious to traverse. In order to get from one end of the first location to the other, so much of your exploration is just walking down more than one long and mostly empty street. It's neither exciting or scary in any regard and does end up feeling like padding. The second section in particular is so open and so vast in scope that even if you know what you have to do, it just feels too large, too tedious, and too monotonous to want to explore or go where you have to. But the third level? Oh, it's peak survival horror. The whole level is this segmented puzzle box design, while all being a classic area that feels straight out of the classic Resident Evil games. Even going as far to straight up take one of the most iconic rooms of the original game. I recognized it instantly and I said out loud to myself, if this room right here is a save point, and before I could even finish the thought, I opened the door, bam, save point, and I thought, you cheeky little bitch. The level itself is a multi-layered clock tower that is tight, concise, and what makes it brilliant is the use of its segmented design while still keeping the main interior of the clock tower its own separate and unique little puzzle box. You'll have to maneuver the interior maze in order to find items that branch out to their own separate segments. You'll have to solve puzzles that incrementally give you hints and answers to the core puzzle that binds this entire level together, and it's actually just perfect. And I really can't emphasize how impressive this is. Hollow Body, a game that released last year and has a prime candidate for one of the most quintessentially designed survival horror levels that I can think of in recent memory, The Apartment, is everything that Heartworm's Clock Tower is, but without the segmented design focus, and is a pure exploration maze puzzle. But not only is its level significantly shorter than the Clock Tower, it's the first level of the game, and the rest of the game afterwards is incredibly linear and rather disappointing from that point onward. But not only does Heartworm maintain at least a consistently good level of quality from the start, it finishes on its best level. Oh, it's so good. It is a genuine rarity to have in any game, let alone an indie game. And on top of being impeccably designed, it also taps into that aspect of survival horror that I think keeps a lot of us fans coming back to the genre over and over, year after year. And that is pitch perfect vibes. And when I said before that Heartworm has vibes, I mean that it has the perfect retro, somber, and listful style kind of vibes. Throughout your time with Heartworm, you'll transcend dimensions, completely breaking any sort of illusion of the question of what is or isn't real. And luckily, in doing so, Heartworm managed to have an incredibly striking visual style of not only memorable locations and images burned into my retinas, such as the lone eyeball frantically looking around over an open casket in front of a never-ending void of a vacant sky, or the entrance of the first main location of the game, which is just an upside-down house set aside that same empty void. While its visual style is familiar, with a lot of the general visual flair skewed towards at least the look of classic pre-rendered environments, what it manages to present to you with that look is something all its own. And Heartworm's visuals are clearly the most striking thing that sets it apart from its contemporaries. So many of the locations that you visit in Heartworm are huge and vacant, a lot of the times otherworldly, and it's not uncommon for me to want to take pause and reflect on the game, or something that Sam has said, or just what's going on in my life at the present moment. I've gone on record saying that I think that horror is the best genre because it not only taps into something primal, but it also caters to something more than us. Horror doesn't have to be scary in the traditional sense. It can be thought-provoking in its messaging, it can be unnerving through its subtlety, and it can affect you deeply through its concepts. And the concept of death is something that comes up frequently within Heartworm, and it's something that is represented visually throughout so much of the game. It's what brought Sam to this house, it's what brought you to this game, and it's what keeps us all here doing whatever it is that we do. The threat of death looming over us all is what keeps many of us going. And Heartworm relishes in death through the narrative setup of the game, through the act of traveling dimensions via previously mentioned casket, the memories shared between a lost relative, and the imminent threat of death and time itself relative to our inevitable demise. Sam self-admittedly thinks about death more than the average person, and she makes it very well known to the player. Normally, the amount of times that she speaks and interrupts the flow of the atmosphere of a location or just a specific scene would frustrate me, and sometimes I can't help myself from wishing that she would just be quiet now and again, as the lack of subtlety is something that does rub me the wrong way in a game like this. But on my second playthrough of the game specifically, I realized that it was much more appreciated as her insights given to us are the game's way of conveying who she is, which, saying out loud, does sound a little silly, but the window given into Sam as a character through that spoken dialogue is a window into the game itself, as her expository memories turn into reflection of the game. As you make progress, the world around you sees a sense of progression, and Sam's character arc inches that much further as well on top of it all. Now, is Heartworm's thematic element groundbreaking or amazing? No, not really. I wouldn't say it's anything that this type of game hasn't attempted and accomplished a dozen times over by this point, but what I will say is that Heartworm succeeds better than most in paralleling the character and the narrative that in the end makes everything coalesce into something worthwhile and does a really good job at telling its narrative. Now, I will say that I think if I was a younger fellow, this game's story would hit me way harder than I think it did now, as the game tackles not only death and the nature of it, but learning to let go, learning to grow up, learning to move on, and learning to find yourself. All of these things would hit me so much harder if I wasn't a 30-something with his feet knee-deep in the wishy-washy pool of life, but I will never take away someone's emotional resonance to this game or its story, as I fully believe that it will speak deeply and resonate with the power of a long-forgotten echo of a choir to someone. Heartworm's emphasis on death influences nearly every artistic decision in it, and whatever I think of every single flare that it influences, I think that the whole is something worth experiencing, even if its final product may come across as potentially derivative of the titans of the genre that came before it. And despite what I have said in this video, I want to be clear that it is okay to be a part of this trope, to be a game so clearly influenced by classic games. But Heartworm, in just about every moment of its runtime, is a game that is so fueled by passion and a sense of purpose that while it didn't make me forget that the game was being so cliched in its mechanics, or even at moments in its narrative, it made me realize that if it's done well, I don't really care. So many games never come close in terms of quality to the titans that they stand on the shoulders of, and while Heartworm isn't the best game in this subgenre of modern indie horror, it is easily one of my personal favorites. Its writing at times is a bit on the nose or a bit unnecessarily wordy and trite, but at other times it is incredibly thought-provoking, moving, and while not saying anything particularly new, it does it in a way that all ties mechanically with its themes. Heartworm, in the end, is a game about letting go and moving on, and I think for a game that is all about nostalgia, it is incredibly poignant that the game is presented in the way that it is. Its visual and mechanical stylings tie in surprisingly well with the narrative in a way that very few games that are so clearly inspired by these older classics ever do. It may be a trope to call back to Silent Hill and Resident Evil so vividly, but Heartworm as a work of art is proof that sometimes it's okay to reflect on the past, to have that warm sensation of nostalgia wash over you, but realize that if you never take the steps to keep yourself from falling victim to the past, you may become trapped there. I know what the titular Heartworm is, even if it may not be what the developer intended, but it doesn't really matter. My heart pangs for the old days of survival horror, but games like Heartworm remind me that they're not gone. They never will be. But unless I look around me and see the good and bad of modern game releases as well, I'll have my own Heartworm, eating me from the inside out, never wanting to take another step, satisfied with only what has been, and never with what could be.
Tomato is a fruit, but it also a vegetable.